Hi everybody, this is Craig Tanner for the Mindful Eye and the Daily Critique. Today's image was created by Chris, who's an intermediate photographer from the UK. Chris says this picture was made at Montrose Basin in Scotland. Chris shot this with a Nikon D300 24-70 f2.8 zoom at an effective focal length of 50 millimeters. Chris says he bracketed 4 frames here, about a stop apart, to extend the dynamic range that he's presented in the final capture. He said there was a lot of contrast up in here in the sky, and he bracketed 4 frames and used the high dynamic range feature inside of Photoshop to combine those to extend the dynamic range he's expressing in the sky. He then converted the image in Lightroom to black and white. Exposure looks like this, ISO 200 f8, and then bracketing exposures around about 1/60th of a second. Under questions and comments, Chris says, is there a simpler way to achieve this high dynamic range result? And I don't know that there is. I mean, I think maybe you could do it in 2 or 3 frames and just manually blend a couple of frames using layers and layer mask, but by the time you do all that, it may be more cumbersome. I wouldn't know without knowing sort of exactly how Chris did this and how much contrast there actually was in the sky, but this seems like a pretty good way to do the work that Chris did. You know, what I really want to talk about in this image is something that's non-technical. It's more about a feeling, and it's more about the power or potential of an image to evoke stories that the viewer is going to make up that can really tie into very powerful emotions. And I think this image has a real strong potential to do that. One of the things I love about this image is when you combine the conversion to black and white, which is abstract things, you combine that with the fact that Chris has left the beach here and the boat very dark, almost silhouette. You can't really tell the construction material here, so this boat could be made up of anything. It could be wood, it could be more of a modern boat, but you just don't know. And that starts to open up a lot of storytelling potential for the viewer. The mooring line is a real strong subject, and it has this texture. You can't tell if that's just the rope that's worn or whether it's been there for a long time, and this is algae or seaweed or so on and so forth. But this adds a lot of character to the story. And then when you combine all of that with this idea is a real powerful archetype in myths and in storytelling. The funeral boat idea from Viking lore and from the Egyptians and other stories that have been passed down, the idea of making the transition from this world at the end of your life into another world, and using the boat as the vehicle to do that is such a powerful archetype. We've seen that over and over again in movies, and to me this image has a lot of potential from just a mythical archetypal standpoint to really make people slow down and be contemplative. This is a subject Chris doesn't mention in his backstory. Maybe this is a powling or maybe it's just a rock, but from perspective and a scale standpoint, it's pretty easy to imagine that that could be the head of a person who's out in the water. To me, that adds a lot to the story. And the other thing that I think plays well in the version that Chris has presented is, even though there's a lot going on in the sky and there's a lot happening up there, there are a lot of real strong value changes, there are a lot of very powerful shape changes, a lot of qualities of line that are different. There's a lot of edge detail in those clouds. Even though there's a lot going on up there, there's still a sense of the sky tying into main subjects in the lower part of the image. The silhouette here and the dark value of the boat play on the major diagonal, top, left to bottom, right, balancing each other out in a powerful way, helps to tie those two areas together, sky and lower part of the image. And then this huge leading line that comes in here and creates a feeling of cross-hatching of diagonals. It's really neat the way the major diagonals are being implied. I talk about this a lot, but it's always worth mentioning again. When we oppose the major diagonals, it creates a combination of really nice tension, but also unity. It helps to tie the image together. A lot of things to enjoy about this image, but I want to just real quickly create a version inside of Photoshop that would mimic what might have happened if we played around with simplifying this by blurring in a variety of ways. We could put on neutral density, and if we had a lot of neutral density, this is at the end of the day, we may be able to get to a very long exposure here, maybe minutes long, and that would simplify the sky and potentially make it more about the boat and maybe evoke more feelings so it's not quite as literal. We could also slow the shutter down to something like a half second and just pan the camera against the whole scene, and then shoot some literal shots and blend those. My thinking, if I was there and I started having these real strong feelings about the journey and the archetype, is that this part of the image might overwhelm what's happening down here. Very graphic, very archetypal. This is a lot more literal and has an enormous amount of visual weight. And I know that if I blur this up here, that I can evoke movement and shapes that are simpler and maybe let the story part of this come forward and the feeling part come forward. Copied the background out of habit for workflow. And this is rough, I know, but I'm just using motion blur in Photoshop and a layer mask to blend that with what was there in the original capture to just kind of suggest what we may have been able to do with either neutral density or panning the camera and then combining more of a literal shot with a blurred shot. Here's what I came up with. I added a layer of noise just to try and tie this back together because I am sort of blending two ideas here. So there's before the green or the noise, and there's after. And once I got to here, that subject of what looks like it could be a person in the water becomes more of a strong idea. It does start to feel potentially more evocative to me. And then I thought about, you could tone this if you wanted to use color as an emotional tool. There's a warm version. There's a cool version. They have very, very different feelings. If I was going to tone it, I'd do the warm, but I actually think I'd like just regular black and white here. Here's before and here is after. Not saying that this is any better. I'm saying it's a variation. To me, this is the main point that I'm trying to make, or the potential big takeaway from the video today, at least in my mind. I'd really encourage you, when you are shooting, to ask yourself how you feel. We can get so carried away with the technical, particularly as landscape photographers, and it can be all about that. And I understand that. I shot landscapes for a long time, and it is potentially, if we're shooting literally, an area in photography where a lot of technique can be required to pull it off. But I also really encourage you to ask yourself how you feel, and also really encourage you to think about story and to try to tie those concepts together. And you might develop a practice as a landscape photographer where you do try to shoot scenes in a literal way, practice sort of your technical literal shooting, and then come up with a variation that is abstract. And one powerful, simple way to do that is the idea of motion blurring. And love to hear your feedback about the video today. I love this image just the way that it is. This is one that would really get my attention, and then it would really make me think in a powerful way about a lot of things. Story, I would really get contemplative, and I did choose this image, and I've spent a lot of time with it. I really love what Chris has done here. I want to say a big thank you to Chris for sharing this image with us. I want to say a big thank you to you for being here. Hope to see you again real soon on the Daily Critique.